I'm Rashad Salamat. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, edging towards another energy crisis. Europe is bracing for a supply crunch as the Iran conflict drags on. So how vulnerable are European nations if disruption deepens? As gas prices soar, so do energy bills. European factories are also under pressure. Governments are stepping in to support businesses and households, but is it enough? So where will the EU turn for gas? It's competing with Asia to snap up supplies, but as energy markets tighten, could European countries turn back to Russia to avoid shortages? It diversified energy supplies, built LNG terminals and reduced its dependency on Russia. Europe thought it had learnt its lesson after the war in Ukraine. But today it's facing another energy shock, and this time it may be even worse as the war in Iran disrupts supply through the Strait of Hormuz. It's happening when EU gas reserves are unusually low. That means Europe will be competing with Asia to fill their storage tanks, which might force the price of LNG even higher. Electricity bills are also climbing, industries under pressure, governments are stepping in to cushion the blow. But why is Europe still so exposed? And what will it take to ensure energy security in the future? Fintan Monaghan reports.
The war being waged by the US and Israel against Iran has caused massive disruptions to global energy flows. The Strait of Hormuz, a key global trade route, has been effectively closed to most shipping. This has cut off around 20% of the world's oil and gas supply. Europe is particularly vulnerable to the disruption. It relies on oil and gas for nearly 60% of its energy needs, and virtually all of it is imported. Prices have already gone up and could rise further as the EU competes with Asia over more limited supplies.
The war's most immediate impact on Europe is on energy. At present, the European Union's physical security of supply is secure. However, Europe is not immune to global price spikes.
One area of immediate concern is gas stockpiles. The EU requires member states to get their reserves to 90% capacity by winter. But right now, they're at less than 30%, the lowest in years. Due to the current crisis, requirements have been relaxed to 80%. But filling the tanks may still be a costly proposition for many member states. It's only been a short time since Europe's last energy crunch. Russia's invasion of Ukraine saw energy prices soar. Europe has since put sanctions on Moscow and moved away from Russian oil and gas. But with prices rising once again, there's pressure to ease those restrictions. The United States has already made some allowances for allies to buy Russian oil. But for now, the EU appears to be resisting that temptation.
We have to be very vigilant and not to actually give Russia what they want, because their appetite will only grow.
But the main alternative could also leave Europe vulnerable. After shifting away from Russia, 60% of European LNG imports now come from the United States. That's made the European Union very dependent on a single trading partner. Critics say this reliance has reduced the EU's leverage in trade negotiations.
I think it's the biggest deal ever made. Thank you very much.
A 2025 deal saw the EU dropping barriers to most American goods, while the US still maintained a 15% tariff on European imports. The agreement also included a $750 billion spend on US oil, LNG, and nuclear technology. In the short term, EU leaders have proposed a range of measures to address the current crisis. These include tax cuts on electricity, state subsidies, and improvements to the efficiency of the power grid. But the long-term strategy for Europe may lie in green energy and nuclear power. Many key policymakers say the bloc can only achieve energy security if it becomes more self-sufficient.
It is clear that the high energy prices form one of the biggest challenges for the European Union's competitiveness. The current crisis in the Middle East and its impact on the global energy supply confirm that the path to follow is the one we chose. It means we have to become more autonomous and rely on our own energy sources.
The latest energy shock has once again exposed Europe's economic weak points. It's now up to its leaders to navigate a path to a more secure future. Fintan Monaghan, Al Jazeera, for Counting the Cost.
The crisis is a challenge for the EU, but not all countries are being affected equally. Italy relies on gas more than any other European economy. The government is cutting taxes on fuel and is funding other measures aimed at lowering petrol prices. Spain's plan is centred on tax cuts on petrol and electricity. Maximum prices have been capped. Germany's response so far is focused on regulating petrol stations. The government wants to restrict price rises on petrol to once per day at a set time. But France is much more insulated from the shock and is holding off on major policy action. It gets around about 70% of its power from nuclear reactors and another 20% from renewables. To discuss this further, I'm joined by a panel of guests. Andres Gaultau is director of the Willy Brandt School of Public Policy at the University of Erfurt, and he joins us now from Berlin. In Paris, we're joined by Rémi Bourgeot. He's an economist of the French Institute for International and Strategic Affairs. He's also the founder of the analysis platform Epistolum. And Chris Wiefer is the CEO of Macro Advisory, a strategic consultancy which focuses on Russia and the Eurasia region, and he joins us from Istanbul. Andreas, let's start off with you. Now, we had this massive attack on Ras Laffan, one of the biggest LNG producers in the world. And this has exposed a structural fragility in the whole LNG ecosystem. What are the implications? Because I think geopolitics has long been underestimated in all this.
Well, Rashad, thanks for having me on the show. So I guess the key point here is that effectively about 20% of LNG supply have been taken off market by closing the Strait of Hormuz. And that was the story maybe a couple of days ago. And now we're moving to a story about structural implications on the supply side. That means upstream and production. So rather than just talking about a question related to the Strait of Hormuz in transit, we're looking at essentially whether and to what extent LNG supply might come back after the strait is open again, and the attacks on Ras Laffan, although it's 5% of global LNG supply only, it signals that on the supply side there might be a bigger structural problem for the LNG market going forward.
Yeah, okay, I mean, this Ras Laffan attack has probably exposed the biggest market nightmare here, which is a new category of risk, if you will. It's the possibility of large-scale LNG infrastructure no longer being immune from geopolitical conflict. So this may well change the reality on the ground, if you will, and look the way that people look at future supply, how it's assessed, financed, and indeed delivered.
Yes, even now there's really an acknowledgement of the importance of geopolitical issues on the energy market. I mean, it should have been obvious for a very long time, but what happened, especially in the case of Europe, there was this rebalancing away from Russia, and before that, a huge reliance on Russia without alternative plans almost, and then this shift to LNG in particular for gas supply without, in each case, really taking into consideration the geopolitical risk involved. And the main thing also concerning Europe has been this shift away from nuclear energy, which really exposes the entire continent to these geopolitical issues with importing oil and gas. So now we are indeed facing deeper issues, not only in terms of transportation of oil and gas and LNG in particular, but really structural issues of production with issues that are going to remain unresolved, even if there's a de-escalation, as Donald Trump so much hopes that it will be the case. In any case, there will be major difficulties ahead in rebuilding capacity, and also with transportation made much more difficult with the situation in the Gulf, with Iran likely to have some sort of control over the Strait of Hormuz. So there's clearly an indication that all these calculations are being made by governments relying on one source of energy, then on another, are indeed very much endangered and are very weak in essence. And they should clearly look to be much more self-reliant in a way, and that was the case in previous decades. This is a rather recent shift to really rely so much on regions. There was really an acknowledgement a long time ago during the 70s oil crisis, and we've clearly moved further backward in recent years.
Chris, we're talking about calculations by different countries. Now, what is the calculus there in Moscow? And what prism is Moscow looking at all this?
Okay, actually, just quickly before I answer that, just following up from the previous speaker, I think this is something that actually has been under various levels of discussion almost since COVID year. Remember, COVID year resulted in big logistics disruption. There was a lot of debate about reliance, particularly on China, and reliance on products of all sorts coming from far away. So at the time that there was the start of some discussion of momentum, maybe towards diversification and kind of shortening transit routes, but it went away. That discussion really faded. But now I think what's happening in the Gulf will really put that back on the table again. So it's not just about energy security. I believe going forward, it'll be a much more serious and broadly based debate about just global transportation, the various choke points, what's happening in the Gulf today could happen in the Straits of Malacca tomorrow, for example, or the English Channel, and about products. So I think just in general, the point I want to make is that I think this will lead to, a much more serious continuation of a debate that started in COVID year. And now I think it will lead to maybe more substantial changes over the next decade. Very quickly on Moscow, of course, it's making a lot more money from exports since the start of this war, oil, gas, but also fertilizer and other products. Of course, we've seen prices rising from. Moscow, the Kremlin is not saying a whole lot at this point. The finance ministry are basically saying that the extra money will just reduce debt, that it won't actually have an impact in terms of economic performance. They're not planning to spend it. Essentially, they're waiting to see how it plays out. But there's no doubt that Russia is one of the countries, along with Australia, Norway, Algeria, and others, that are making a lot more money because of this. And even if it were to stop tomorrow, even if the shooting were to stop tomorrow, as you've mentioned, the damage that has been caused to various production facilities and probably the legacy wariness of Gulf risk from insurance companies and operators means that the price of oil and gas will stay elevated, maybe not over $100 Brent, but certainly a lot more than it was in January and February and for a long time. So yeah, Moscow basically making a lot of money, their balance sheet in a much healthier position. And I think to some extent are now looking with a certain amount of bemusement, and I don't mean to use that word flippantly, but a certain amount of bemusement with the plight of the European Union, because as you know, the European Union has adopted a program to ban the import of any new LNG from April 25th, and then any new pipe gas from July, and to ban the import of all remaining Russian oil and gas from the 1st of January next year. So essentially, Moscow is waiting to see what Europe does next.
And Remy, to that point, did Europe not really learn its lesson from the Ukraine invasion? And also, as Chris was mentioning, what was happening during COVID here as well? Will they be forced into actually buying Russian energy?
Well, every time a crisis erupts, they realize that they're very much endangered by one specific type of dependency, and then they shift to another one, or they increase another kind of dependency, in this case on the Gulf, as a replacement for Russia. Also reliance on US LNG, that's been really a major shift in recent years. And the focus should be much more on self-reliance, production. Nuclear energy is clearly an option. When it comes to imports from Russia, that's clearly a taboo. And what we have to realize is really this extraordinary shift from extreme reliance on Russia before the Ukraine war, and then a complete, almost complete attempt to replace that source of energy. That makes for very poor planning in the end. And now, indeed, there's a kind of dead end. But Europe is not the most exposed area when it comes to the Iran crisis, the Gulf crisis, and in general, its imports are rather limited in comparison with Asia, for example. So it's not so much of a huge supply shock as it is for other world regions, but clearly the price increases is being felt very, very acutely.
Yeah, and that's it, isn't it, Andreas? It may not be a supply shock, but it certainly is a price shock, and that can reverberate through the economy.
Absolutely, yes. I mean, just to put a number into the conversation, the U.S. companies are benefiting from $3 gas at the moment, and Europe is paying 16 or 17, and that's essentially, if it lasts, the end of European industry. So it's a price shock indeed. It's not a supply shock. The problem here is not necessarily, I guess, in geopolitical terms, that Europe hasn't learned its lesson. Although, they could have done better. I guess the bigger picture here is that we now rely on a supplier, that's the US, which has started to think very politically about energy supplies. The whole energy dominance agenda is playing into this. And that's where a lot of uncertainty comes from as well. We have seen some statement coming out of Washington, D.C. Over the weekend to the effect that LNG supplies might be put in question, or at least favorable access to LNG supplies might be put in question should the EU not adopt the Turnberry Agreement. So there is this issue linkage already going on, which probably adds uncertainty to market sentiments and might keep prices up. One thing going forward, I guess, is to think very much about how you can put structural brakes into the system and how you can bring gas demand, oil demand down structurally. And nuclear won't help here because that's electrons. We need molecules, and molecules need to come from indeed other places, but also renewables. And that's essentially a place to go in addition to efficiency gains. And that's where the Europeans still have a long way to go.
Yeah, Andreas, on that point, I just want to pick up on something here. All right, well, it should be the case that they should be repairing the roof while it's sunny, because we are going into the summer. Gas demand will fall as a consequence of that. Should they be replenishing at the moment and fixing their reserves because they're unusually low?
I mean, Europe is between a rock and a hard place at the moment. On the one hand, they need to replenish gas supplies or reserves. Whilst on the other hand, they need to manage a price crisis, and that's something which both adds to the bill, if you want. But I guess you can turn this into an opportunity, if you will. You can say, look, maybe it's exactly the moment in time when we come forward with stringent, ambitious governmental policy programs trying to think about the big demand centers within the economy. That's on the one hand, when it comes to oil, transport, because transport is 45 to 50% of oil demand in Europe. You can electrify that, and you can think about e-vehicles. And on the other hand, you can think about heating systems. That's the housing sector, and that's exactly where your rooftops come in. You can think about essentially turning the heating system from a molecules-based system to an electrons-based system, heat pumps and all these kind of things. And that would go a long way, really, already to reducing structural demand to weather the next storm, which will come inevitably, because as long as we rely on fossil, volatile global markets, we're structurally exposed to risks we cannot or can hardly manage on our own.
Yeah, and with all that in mind, Chris, I mean, we talked about Russia being a beneficiary in terms of money, at least. That's short term. What's the longer term outlook?
Yeah, no, I think you absolutely have to, shall we say, not panic over what's happening over the long term. Over the short term, there are certainly very few options. Europe, but also, as Speaker mentioned, India, China and other Asian countries are all facing even more difficulties over the short to medium term. And Russia, like Australia and others, are making money over the short, perhaps even medium term. But longer term, I guess, how many wake-up calls do you need? But longer term, that there are plenty of options that can resolve this. Diversification of energy sources, a much more effective investment into renewables, perhaps building more LNG plants in more diverse parts of the world, which we know is possible. and diversifying, transport links or supply sourcing. So long term, you can fix this for sure. It's and it's only over the short to medium term where the importers are going to feel a lot of financial pain and inflationary pressures, and the exporters outside the Gulf are going to make a lot of money. But for Russia, it really doesn't solve much. It brings in extra money, but Russia still has to deal with the fact that it's got an economy that's still too reliant on energy and resources. Yes, the amount of oil and gas in the budget has come down to about 25%. It used to be 50, but it's still very exposed to resources and materials of all sorts. And I say the question is, will Russia now finally, 25 years of talking about the need to much more greatly diversify the economy, will they finally do it? And the same in Europe and other countries for also a couple of decades talking about the need to diversify their energy and to make it a lot more balanced, and really haven't done a lot about it. Is this the event that finally makes everybody a lot more serious about what they need to do? Unfortunately, history suggests that complacency comes back quicker than innovation, but nevertheless, it is clear. Short term, there's nothing you can do. You're going to have to suck up the price increases because there's no way around it. But long term, like 3-4 years out, there's a lot that can be done by everybody, both on the supply side and on the consumption side.
Remy, with that in mind, I mean, we had the French economy minister today saying that they're downgrading their growth forecast for the French economy for this year. Now, what can European nations do to mitigate the economic shock?
Well, France and Europe more generally were already in a poor situation before this crisis erupted, and this clearly makes things much worse. I mean, you have a financial crisis coming, and this is affecting governments a lot, especially highly indebted governments like France, in terms of the interest rates they have to pay in the market. And this inflationary trends are clearly making this much more difficult at this moment.
Remy,
so,
can I interrupt for a second? You mentioned central banks, you mentioned interest rates, but this is not demand pull, it's cost push inflation. Monetary policy surely cannot really deal with that.
Well, absolutely. But the fact is they are going to try to somehow limit the rise in inflation, either with hiking interest rates or avoiding to lower them, as was the trend before this crisis. And this is going to accelerate the economic slowdown. Indeed, of course, this is rather vain because it's clearly an exogenous inflationary crisis that we are facing, but we have to take this reaction into consideration, and we'll have this weight on economic activity from interest rates, and more importantly, or more worryingly, this will make the debt trajectory for some countries like France even more precarious, with budget deficits which are already extremely high and not really under control. Yeah. So this is indeed very bad news. Then all governments are trying to put in place some measures to somehow mitigate the effect of this energy crisis. But most of the time, these are rather short-term patches rather than structural solutions, obviously.
I want to get to Chris. Now, you see, this would be a knee-jerk, incorrect policy response using monetary tools. What should these countries be doing in that case?
Well, I mean, the options are very limited. As you say, limited monetary tools. Obviously, all they can do right now is firefight a little bit to make sure that there is no shortage of energy. Prices will rise; that's inevitable. But at least ensuring that there is some supply available, and that keeps the economies moving forward and prevents job losses and other damage that would take a long time to repair. So really, the options are relatively limited. And one other point would be interesting to see how countries kind of cooperate with each other. Now, you mentioned the introduction to Italy as a country that relies on imported energy, but Italy has a very secure supply. They get oil and gas directly from Azerbaijan, and they have a long-term supply contract with Kazakhstan. So even though they are going to suffer price increases because global prices have gone up, their supply is secure. Perhaps the same with importers, Dutch importing LNG. Will they keep that to supply their own economies, or will they kind of take a hit and make sure that what they have available from the supply source will go to the other countries that don't have it? So, this will be not just a kind of policy and monetary response, but it's also going to be a political cooperation response within Europe, because some countries have a better and more secure supply than others, and will they share?
Andreas, to you, I mean, will it then mean European countries have to find alternative supply places? And what also is likely to happen, surely, is it'll hasten the process towards renewables.
Well, in the short term, there isn't very much, additional supply that you can find. The only thing you can do, and I would second Chris here, is try and cooperate and coordinate, also beyond Europe. I mean, think about the other big demand centers: Japan, South Korea, possibly China. These are demand centers that are now in a price competition or even a price war with Europe for a limited amount of molecules. And even if the price goes higher, there is no additional supply available. So I guess the key issue here would be to say, how can we avoid a price war with other regions for a limited supply, because it essentially means less liquidity and welfare losses for everyone on the importing side. I think that's a key issue to take care of. Structurally, and I would agree, the answer is, and that's what Remy also said, is to try and go for homegrown energy sources. That means more renewables, more wind, more solar, more offshore wind farms.
Andreas?
I mean, at the very end, you can get quite a bit of bang for the buck if you put a couple of $1 billion or euros somewhere outside in the North Sea, and within a couple of months, if you do it well, get quite a few gigawatts available for the domestic grid. That's the way to go.
Andreas Golthal, Remy Bourgeois, and Chris Weaver, thank you so much for joining us. And that's our show for this week. Get in touch with us on X at Richard TV, and do use the hashtag AJCTC when you do. Or drop us an email. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our address. But there's more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That'll take you straight to our page, which has individual reports, links, and entire episodes for you to catch up on. That's it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Rashad Salamat, and from the whole team here in Doha, thank you for joining us. Al Jazeera's coverage of the war continues in just a moment.